Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. At the end of the Cold War, in the early 1990s, there was a spirit of triumphalism in the capitals of the Western world. That triumphalism took kind of two forms. The first was a kind of a relief that the Soviet Union had ceased to be, and had ceased to be without global conflict. And the demise of the Soviet Union is really quite extraordinary and quite unprecedented. You look at the kind of the decline and fall of the British Empire, it's extraordinarily violent affair. You think the partition of India, the partition of Palestine. If you think about the wars of decolonization that follow that kind of precede and follow the decline of the British Empire in Africa. Um, British history, mainstream kind of British discourse around decolonization prides us on this sort of notion that it was all really rather civilized. It's like, well, yeah, it depends, doesn't it? It really depends who you were and where you were. And if you were on a train going between India and Pakistan, it definitely wasn't. Anyway, anyway, the decline of the Soviet Union, we'd see almost no violence at the time, but of course, perhaps we are in history's kind of extra time, so to speak, right now. Um, as triumphalism said also, not few, we've managed to kind of triumph over the Soviet Union without having to fight, or without it turning into kind of bloody chaos from kind of Berlin to Vladivostok, but also capitalism, and a particular mode of capitalism, neoliberalism, this sort of Reaganite, Thatcherite version of capitalism, has triumphed. And now we can see why. We can see of the horrors of the Soviet Union, the horrors of Stalinism and of the camps and all the other terrible things that happened, and the terror. But also we can see backwardness and inefficiency. We can see poor living standards. We can see that there are Russian people with much lower living standards than Western people. And there was no small amount of Schadenfreude over that one. And the idea that um, the any kind of command economy was doomed to fail. And because of this idea of inefficiency, it won't be efficient because it's not listening to this powerful thing called the market. Of course, the market and is an abstraction that people create for themselves. That it is the market is a set of kind of relations between buyers and sellers and the state. And so, the state always has a role in actually creating markets. This is one thing that gets kind of overlooked a lot of the time. So, I'm going to dive back into Christina Spore's book, Post Wall, Post Square. I picked this book up in one of them £5 shops that you get, like the works, but a bit posher. And it's great, it's a fantastic book for and if Christina Sport, if you're listening, I will happily pay you the other 10 quid that this book's probably worth, because it really is. It's a great book. It should be it shouldn't be sort of hidden away in a £5 shop. Anyway, so Christina Spore writes of Gorbachev. To achieve reform and rejuvenation, Gorbachev had to reduce the burden of the military-industrial complex on the Soviet economy, intensified during the 1980s by the war in Afghanistan and the spiralling arms race with America. To be sure, the Soviet command economy was performing poorly simply for structural reasons, a fact masked by the global oil price rise of the 1970s and the country's vast Siberian reserves which fueled a GDP growth rate of 2 to 3.5% between 1971 and 1980. But when the oil price dropped in the next decade, national income fell sharply. Indeed, in the 1980 to 85, the USSR found itself at near zero growth. The increasing dissatisfaction of Soviet consumers was exacerbated by declining living standards and limited access to high-tech civilian goods. This was due in part to the inflexibility of the planned economy and the lack of industrial modernization, but the root problem was that perhaps up to a quarter of GDP was being gobbled up by the military sector to the detriment of civilian production. This, I think, is far more significant. To give you a sense of numbers here, at the moment, the NATO allies, and most of them don't even commit to this, but NATO allies are meant to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. And that's a lot of money. NATO allies that spend 3% or more are considered to be doing quite well. Britain has some rather kind of ambitious ideas, to put it mildly, of spending up to 5%. But to spend a quarter of the entire worth of the nation on defence and not be fighting a war on the level of kind of Barbarossa is staggering. And this, whatever one has to say about command economies, this is a far bigger culprit as to why consumer living standards are low in the Soviet Union. I was in the Soviet Union for the last year of its existence in 1990, and the picture was mixed. I travelled from Siberia to Moscow to St. Petersburg, and I can remember at the time that there were consumer goods in the Soviet Union, and there were people looking desperately to access what they saw as Western goods, Western electronics, simple things like CD players and obviously branded jeans and things like that. But the idea that it was a country, I mean, having compared it mentally with extraordinarily poor countries I've been to, it doesn't really quite compare. It certainly was a country that didn't appear to have living standards anywhere near that of Western countries, Western European countries. But it wasn't. Anecdotally, I didn't see destitution. I saw destitution when you start to come to Western countries and see how poor people lived. That's a slightly different story. But the defense industry is the real reason, in my mind, why the Soviet Union was incapable of satisfying consumer demand. In order to galvanize the economy at home while slowly opening it up to the outside world, Gorbachev needed to foster a stable international environment and also address the USSR's imperial overstretch in Eastern Europe and the developing world. This meant reducing US hostility, disengaging from the arms race, and making compromises in the Third World, including ideological recognition of the right to self-determination. So domestic policy was inextricably bound up with foreign policy. Seeking a less confrontational relationship with the United States, Gorbachev was keen to talk with his American opposite number. At first glance, however, US President Ronald Reagan seemed an unlikely partner. Born in 1911, and so the same age as the man Gorbachev had just replaced, Reagan was a vehement anti-communist who had intensified the arms race once he came to power in 1981. He was notorious for his denunciation of the USSR as an evil empire and for his prediction that the march of freedom and democracy would leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history. This all-out ideological competition, he believed, justified the military build-up of his early years.
But there was another side to Reagan, the would-be peacemaker, who saw military power as a basis for diplomacy to secure peace through strength. Even more surprising, this hard-headed realist cherished a utopian belief in a nuclear-free world. This is indeed true. Reagan had his Damascene moment. I forget the documentary he saw, but he was suddenly decided he was appalled by nuclear weapons, and even offered to Gorbachev that they be dismantled unilaterally, multilaterally, or bilaterally. How that doesn't happen is a sort of bit of a story for a different time. Reagan is a kind of a very strange character, very paradoxical figure. This absolutely brutal intervener in Central America, who is responsible for appalling crimes in places like Nicaragua, and yet still able, with a straight face, I suppose this is the art of being an American president, really, able with a straight face to lecture other powers on freedom and democracy, and to call the Soviet Union an evil empire. Reagan was a kind of, at the same time, a sort of hard-headed negotiator and fantasist, as his kind of faith in this imaginary Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative project indicates. During his first term, Reagan had been unable to initiate dialogue with the sick old men of the Kremlin. But with the accession of Gorbachev, not merely dialogue, but negotiation suddenly became possible. Over the course of 4 summits between Geneva in November 1985 and Moscow in May-June 1988, the discussions were often heated, but the two leaders gradually forged a relationship based on personal trust and even affection. Gorbachev's radical nuclear arms reduction proposals at Reykjavik in October 1986, 6 months after the horrendous Chernobyl accident, almost carried Reagan along with him, to the horror of some die-hard advisors. But by the time of their Washington meeting in December 1987, they'd moved on to first-name terms. There was also substance in the new relationship. At Washington, Reagan and Gorbachev signed away a whole category of nuclear weapons in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first time the superpowers had ever agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals. Here was a significant step in defusing the Cold War, making it less likely that nuclear conflict would break out. Atomic scientists put back their celebrated doomsday clock to 6 minutes before midnight instead of 3. And on the 31st of May 1988, when Reagan was asked in Red Square whether he still felt the USSR was an evil empire, he replied, "I was talking about another time, another era." Reagan was moving on, and so was Gorbachev. 6 months later, the dramatic address at the UN on the morning of the 7th of December was, for the Soviet leader, a watershed moment. So I've talked from this book before. Gorbachev visited the United Nations in New York in December 1988. He, Gorbachev, wanted to present himself as a shaper of international affairs, but unlike Churchill, moving the world out of the Cold War. And he was keen to wrongfoot the Americans, especially at a time of transition between presidents when their foreign policy would be in limbo. The Americans are scared that we might do something as in the spirit of Reykjavik. He had been preparing the speech for months, ever since Reagan's visit, and it went through many drafts, being tweaked right up to the last minute. Gorbachev was determined to use the occasion to show the world his belief in the bright future of the rejuvenated Soviet Union, and to confirm his credentials as a visionary peacemaker. And he hoped that by setting out his new political thinking in such eye-catching way, he would secure Western credits and economic assistance.
To realize the future America needs, we understand what's needed from us. To face each threat head on. We've earned our place in the fight for our nation's future. We are Marines. We were made for this.
By the time Gorbachev arrived at the UN, the vast General Assembly hall was totally packed, with all 1,800 seats occupied. There was a buzz of excited chatter. Expectations were high. Gorbachev stepped up to the podium dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, white shirt, and a burgundy-coloured tie. At the start of his address, he spoke slowly and deliberately, but then gathered pace with an increasing sweep and authority. In doing so, he set out his ideological blueprint for how Marxism-Leninism should evolve and how the world should extricate itself from the Cold War. He began with remarks that drew together Western and Eastern European history around the revolutionary idea. Two great revolutions, the French Revolution of 1789 and the Russian Revolution of 1917, have exerted a powerful influence on the actual nature of the historical process and radically changed the course of world events. Both of them, each in its own way, have given a gigantic impetus to man's progress. Having detoxified revolution and established common ground across the divided continent, Gorbachev expiated on the universality of human experience. Today we've entered an era where progress will be based on the interests of all mankind, and insisted that future progress was possible only through a truly global consensus in a movement towards what he called a new world order. If that was so, he added, then it is also worth agreeing on the fundamental and truly universal prerequisites and principles for such activities. It is evident, for example, that force and the threat of force can no longer be and should not be instruments of foreign policy. Here was an explicit renunciation of the Brezhnev doctrine, Moscow's claimed right to deploy the Red Army within its own sphere of influence, to save a fellow communist state that in 1968 had justified the use of tanks to crush the Prague Spring. Instead, considering the variety of socio-political structures, he declared freedom of choice to be a universal principle that knows no exception. And there, in the renunciation of the Brezhnev doctrine, we see going to be a huge strand of the Soviet Empire unravel. Of course, there was pragmatism behind this. The Gorbachev knew that an intervention in a Warsaw Pact state and the occupation of a Warsaw Pact state was militarily and diplomatically and economically unfeasible. It had been hard enough. The lesson of Afghanistan had taught the Soviet Union and the Red Army the limitations of its military power, and a long-term occupation of, say, Czechoslovakia in order to prevent it from breaking away from the Warsaw Pact would now be almost inconceivable. So Gorbachev was thinking big, way beyond the conventional bipolarities of East and West. And after more than 40 years of the Cold War, he was explicitly advocating the de-ideologization of interstate relations, and thereby declaring an end to the third world interventionism. Indeed, with the world as a whole now seriously tackling hunger, disease, illiteracy, and other mass ills, he argued for recognizing the primacy of the universal human idea. Nevertheless, he did not intend to abandon Soviet values. The fundamental fact remains that the formation of the peaceful period will take place in conditions of the existence and rivalry of various socio-economic and political systems. However, he went on, the meaning of our international efforts, and one of the key tenets to the new thinking, is precisely to impart to this rivalry the quality of sensible competition in conditions of respect for freedom of choice and balance of interests, so that the two systems would not blur into each other, but their relationship would become one of peaceful co-development. In this way, working together, the superpowers would be able to eliminate the nuclear threat and militarism, whose eradication was essential for world development and the survival of the human race. And also the continuation of the Soviet Union, a big chunk of the 25% military of GDP military budget obviously went on nuclear arms. And Gorbachev particularly was interested in anything that would reduce this burden. In addition to his grand vision, Gorbachev made specific proposals, especially terminating the 9-year intervention in Afghanistan, the USSR's equivalent of America's Vietnam, and on disarmament, which he called the most important topic without which no problem of the coming century can be resolved. He spoke of the need for a new strategic arms reduction treaty, START, reducing each superpower's arsenal by 50%, and to put a pressure on the United States, he unveiled a unilateral proposal to cut Soviet troop strength in Europe by 500,000 men over the next 2 years. In this way, Gorbachev sought to initiate a shift from the economy of armament to an economy of disarmament. And in order to win the Cold War, Reagan had to help disarmament in the Soviet Union. Reagan had to diplomatically help the Soviet Union to militarily disengage from Europe. Such a conversation had become absolutely essential to underpin his project of a profound renewal of the entire socialist society, a project that had grown vastly in scope since 1985 as he developed his big ideas of perestroika and glasnost. Indeed, Gorbachev explained, under the sign of democratization, perestroika had now spread to politics, the economy, intellectual life, and ideology. Soviet democracy would be placed on a solid normative base, including laws on the freedom of conscience, glasnost, public associations and organizations. Nevertheless, in order not to tempt anybody to encroach on the security of the Soviet Union and its allies while the Kremlin undertook much-needed bold revolutionary transformations, Gorbachev was adamant that the USSR's defense capability should be maintained at what he termed a level of reasonable and reliable sufficiency. Such language was a marked change from the pursuit of superiority that had dominated East-West relations for most of the Cold War. Serious differences had existed, he admitted, and tough problems had to be resolved between the superpowers, but the Soviet leader was essentially upbeat about the future as he looked around the hall. We have already graduated from the primary school of learning to understand each other and seek solutions in both our common interests. So this is really interesting and really worth kind of just pausing to analyze here. Gorbachev came to the United Nations to extricate the Soviet Union from an economic and defense spending crisis that would inevitably have led to the downfall probably of the Soviet regime eventually. And yet, what Gorbachev does in embracing perestroika is to gradually create the seeds of the dissolution of the Soviet state, a state that he hoped to be able to modernize, that he hoped to be able to adapt, but ultimately that it lacked the capability to do so, and instead leads to this kind of fissile explosion of nationalisms across the Soviet Union. Anyway, I'll leave you there. But again, it's a great book. I thoroughly recommend it, and well worth a read. Thanks very much. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
At Capella University, learning online doesn't mean learning alone. You'll get support from people who care about your success, like your enrollment specialist who gets to know you and the goals you'd like to achieve. You'll also get a designated academic coach who's with you throughout your entire program. Plus, career coaches are available to help you navigate your professional goals. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.